This is Jennifer Duffy, your professor, once again. I'm here to talk to you about Chapter 8 in the Creswell textbook. And as I told you in the past, I'm more of a qualitative researcher than a quantitative researcher. So I find this chapter to be really fun. This is when you get to look at the patterns and the themes that emerge from your data collection in qualitative research. I think it's really interesting and fun to start to see what emerges from your data collection. You might have hunches as you're collecting your data as to what the themes and patterns might be in your data, but now we can really do it from a scientific way and interpret it and analyze it. So let's talk about analyzing and interpreting qualitative data. This process requires you to make sense of text and images, perhaps, so that you can answer your research questions. So in this chapter, we will learn about the 6 steps involved in analyzing and interpreting qualitative data. They are preparing and organizing the data, exploring the data and coding it, describing findings and forming themes, representing and reporting findings, and interpreting the meanings of the findings, and finally validating the accuracy of the findings. So if you remember back to the chapter on analyzing and interpreting quantitative research, there was also 6 steps, but those steps were very different. And so we are going to embark on understanding a whole new process of analyzing and interpreting for qualitative data. The 6 steps commonly used in analyzing qualitative data are not always taken in sequence, and this differs from quantitative research, and we'll talk about this more in the upcoming PowerPoints. But basically, the process begins with representing and preparing and organizing the data for analysis, engaging in initial exploration of the data through the process of coding it, and we'll talk about what coding means, so don't worry if you're not familiar with the term. Then the researcher also uses the code to develop a more general picture of data, such as the descriptions and themes, and the researcher then represents the findings through narratives and visuals, and finally makes an interpretation of the meaning of the results by reflecting both personally on the impacts of the findings and on the literature that might inform the findings. And finally, and importantly as well, you need to talk as a researcher about the accuracy of your findings in qualitative research. So qualitative interpretation is an inductive form going from the particular or detailed information, detailed data, such as transcripts or typed notes from interviews, to the general, to codes, and then to themes. So keep this in mind when you're trying to understand qualitative research and how qualitative researchers go about producing broad themes and categories from very diverse, detailed databases. So at first, the initial analysis consists of subdividing the data, which we'll talk about, which is called coding the data. The final goal of qualitative analysis is to generate a larger, more consolidated picture. You're telling a story in qualitative research. Now, it involves a simultaneous process of analyzing data while you're also collecting data. So in qualitative data collection and analysis, they can happen at the same time. They can be simultaneous activities. When you are collecting data, you might also be analyzing. And this procedure is different from quantitative research, remember, in which your data collection always occurs first and then your analysis follows. So in qualitative research, we say the phases are iterative, meaning that you go back and forth between data collection and analysis. In qualitative research, you might collect stories from individuals and then realize you need more information to fill in the gaps from their stories as you begin your analysis. Qualitative researchers analyze their data by reading it several times over and over and over again and conducting an analysis each time. So each time a researcher reads their data, they develop a deeper understanding about the information collected from the participants. Now, there is no single accepted approach to analyzing qualitative data, although there are several guidelines that exist for this process, and we will talk about them. But unlike quantitative research, remember, quantitative research, you have set statistics to analyze your data depending on the type of variables you have and the number of variables. In qualitative research, there are many different approaches you can use to analyzing the data. We say that qualitative research is interpretive research because we make a personal assessment of the description that fits the situation and the themes to capture the major categories of information. The interpretation that you make of a transcript might differ from another person who's reading the same transcript. This does not mean that your interpretation is better or more accurate. It simply means that you as a researcher bring your own perspective to your interpretation. And we'll talk about subjective bias in interpreting qualitative research later in this chapter. So as I was saying in the prior slide, the process of qualitative data collection and analysis is an iterative process. You might begin collecting your data and start analyzing it and then realize you need more information, so you go back to the field and you collect more and then you analyze more. So it's simultaneous and iterative. So if you look at this slide at the bottom, the first step is that the researcher has to collect the data. And this could be field notes, interview notes, or transcriptions. Now, you have to prepare that data for analysis. So you have to maybe transcribe your interview notes after you recorded them. And this can take, we'll talk about this, but this can take a lot of time. Sorry, my dog just barked in the background. And then you have to read through the data several times. It's a very important step, is that people often, or students often, forget the importance of just reading through the material. They want to jump right into analyzing the data. And you can't forget, or I can't underscore enough, the importance of just reading it to get a general sense of the material first before you jump into trying to analyze it. So don't skip that step. Then you engage in a process called coding. And we're going to talk about this in more depth. But how a researcher codes the data by locating text in the data and assigning a code or label that describes them. And then once you have codes, you use the codes to describe what you found in the data and also to report on the themes that were used in the data. So we're going to talk in more depth about each of these steps, but this is just an overview of the process of how you go from collecting your data to preparing the data, to reading the data, to analyzing the data. Let's talk about the first step, how to prepare and organize your data to get it ready for analysis. Initial preparation of the data for analysis requires organizing a lot of information and sometimes transferring it from spoken or written word to a typed file, and making decisions about whether to analyze the data by hand or by computer. And we're going to talk about the options, the positives and negatives about each option. There are plenty of people who still do it by hand, the analysis part, coding part, and there are a lot of people now who use computer software. I'm a big fan of using the computer software, but I was trained using the hand method. So we will talk about that when we get to that stage. But I want to talk about the early stages of qualitative analysis when you organize the data. Sometimes you might use file folders or computer folders but I want to emphasize that organization of data is really important because of the large amount of information gathered during a study. Sometimes the amount of data that's collected during a qualitative study can surprise new researchers. For example, a 30-minute interview will often result in about 20 pages of single-spaced transcription. So with this large amount of data, the transcribing and organizing of information requires that you be very organized as you prepare the data. Here are some suggestions. You might want to develop a matrix or a table of sources that can be used to help organize the material, or you might organize the material by interviews or by observations, or maybe all documents. And you might consider organizing the material in a different way, by participant, or by site, or by location. You can do it any way or combine these ways as long as it makes sense to you. And that's what's different than quantitative research. Quantitative research, you have to follow a prescribed pattern of how you go about preparing and organizing your data for analysis. In qualitative research, there's more flexibility, and you can follow, as long as you're organized and you document your process, you can follow the procedures that is most comfortable and most suitable for your preferences. And another thing to remember is always to keep duplicate copies of your materials. After you transcribe the data, you then want to get it ready for computer analysis or hand analysis. But the most important thing to remember about preparing and organizing the data is to be very detailed, document how you're organizing all aspects of the data, and keep duplicate copies of all observations and all interviews and all field notes. So with the popularity of computers, researchers have a choice about whether to hand analyze data or to use a computer. The hand analysis process means that researchers read the data, mark it by hand, divide it into parts. This means analyzing text data involving using color coding to mark parts of the text or cutting and pasting text sentences onto cards. Some qualitative researchers like to hand analyze all of their data. A hand analysis might be preferred in the following cases. Maybe if the researcher is not comfortable using a qualitative computer software program, or when the researcher wants to be close to the data and have a hands-on approach without the intrusion of a software program. Or another benefit is if the researcher has the time to commit to a hand analysis. It's a labor-intensive activity, and it takes time to manually sort, organize, and locate words in a text database. For other qualitative researchers who are comfortable with technology and have the time to learn a computer program, they might engage in a computer analysis of qualitative data, which means that researchers use a qualitative computer to help them store, analyze, sort, and represent data. With the development of these computer programs, researchers can now decide whether they want to hand code or do computer analysis. Sometimes researchers might choose a computer programming software if they have large database. Say they have more than 500 pages of transcripts from interview notes, field notes, and observation notes, and they need to keep track of this extensive information. If you have the resources to purchase a computer software program, although there are many software companies that offer discounts for students. And let me talk about the different types of qualitative software programs. There's Atlas TI, there's Hyper Research, which I'm a big fan of, there's Inevo, there's Max CUDA. I've never used that and I've never heard of it before. The text recommends it. But things to think about when you're looking at deciding whether to use qualitative software. You want to make sure it's compatible, whether you're using a Windows or a Mac, that you can easily work through the document. You want to make sure that it might be able to handle text data as well as multimedia images. You want to make sure you can highlight it and connect quotations, and that you can search for specific text passage. Does it have the capability for you to add notes or memos to it? And how do you categorize the data? Can you develop codes? Can you easily apply codes to the text or images? Can you display codes? Can you review and make changes to the codes? And then once you code the data in a computer software, how do you sort for specific codes? Does it allow you to combine codes or collapse codes in a search? So there's a lot to think about. In quantitative data, we import data such as into SPSS. In qualitative data, you import your Word file or your image into your qualitative database program. And I've learned by using hand analysis, color coding the data. So each code that I labeled for specific text would get a certain color, and then I would make a chart or a little tool what each color represented for each code. And then I also learned on HyperResearch how to download the transcriptions and highlight text and give codes to the different text segments. And then I learned how to collapse those codes and search for different codes. I find it easier to use HyperResearch, the qualitative software program. It doesn't do the work for you, but it helps majorly in saving you time when you have the codes assigned and you want to start analyzing the codes and collapsing the codes to find the emerging themes. So if any of you have any questions about which qualitative software program to use or whether to use hand analysis or software analysis, please let me know and we can discuss this in further detail. Okay, so after you've organized and transcribed your data and decided whether to use your hand or a computer software program, you begin data analysis. And this first begins with exploring the data and developing codes. The first step, or preliminary step, in qualitative research just is all about exploration of the data to obtain a general sense of the data, where you can write down ideas, think about the organization of the data, and consider whether you need more information or more data to answer your research questions. It's highly suggested by authors, by myself, by anybody who has experience in qualitative research that you read the transcript several times. This is called immersion in data, when you immerse yourself in the details and try to get a sense of the interview as a whole before breaking it down into themes. Writing notes in the margins of the transcriptions helps you with this process of exploration. And the notes can be short phrases, ideas, concepts, or hunches that occur to you. The further process of analyzing text, or sometimes images, in qualitative research begins when you code the data. Now you might be saying, what does code mean? What is coding? So if you're unfamiliar with qualitative research, coding is going to be a new term for you. But basically, it's the process of segmenting and labeling text to form descriptions and themes of the data. Now, there's no set guidelines to coding data, but some general suggestions and procedures do exist. The object, or the main point of coding, is to make sense out of the data. You want to divide your text into segments and label these segments with codes. And then you want to examine the codes for overlap and redundancy. And finally, collapse these codes into broad themes. Thus, as I said earlier, qualitative analysis is an inductive process of narrowing data into a few broad themes. In addition, you will select specific data to use and disregard other data that does not specifically provide evidence for your themes. Now, there are several steps involved in coding data, and although there is no specific procedure you have to follow, I'm going to tell you about some recommendations about how to go about doing this. As I've been saying throughout this PowerPoint, it's very important for you to read the transcriptions carefully, to read them several times and to get a sense of the whole picture, and to jot down notes in the margins of some ideas that come to mind as you read. You might pick one document, such as an interview, and choose the most interesting, the shortest, or maybe the one on the top of the pile, and go through it and ask yourself, what is this person really saying? Consider the underlying meanings and write it down in the margins in 2 or 3 words. Get to the essence of what is being communicated in the transcript. To begin the process of coding, you need to involve identifying text segments, placing a bracket around them, and then assigning a code word or code phrase that accurately describes the meaning of the text segment. Sentences, or sometimes paragraphs, all of which relate to a single code, are called a text segment, and codes are labels used to describe that text segment or image. And codes can address many different topics, such as the setting and the context, the perspectives held by participants, the participants' way of thinking about things, processes, activities, strategies, relationships, or social structures. You can also use the participants' actual words, and this is called in vivo coding, as your codes. Okay? Or you can also use terms from the literature that you've gotten from your lit review as your codes. So you can either come up with your own codes, you can use in vivo coding, which is when the researcher uses the actual participant words to summarize what a text segment was, or you can use terms from the literature. You do not need to code each sentence or provide multiple codes for each sentence. And sometimes beginning or novice qualitative researchers code every single word or every single sentence multiple times. Instead, you want to think about lean coding. And this is the first time you go through a manuscript, you assign only a few codes. For example, if you have a 20-page manuscript, you might only use 10 to 15 codes the first time you analyze it. And this way, you can reduce a smaller number of codes to broad themes. Rather than if you have 50 codes, it's much harder to collapse the codes into themes. So after you read through the data or you read it several times, then you might take your first approach at coding the data. After you code it, make sure you make a list of all your code words. Then what you do is you group similar codes and look for redundant codes. So your goal is to reduce the list of codes to a smaller, more manageable number, such as 25 to 30. So say you go through a 30-page document and you have 50 codes, you might want to collapse the codes or reduce them, or ones that are overlapping in meaning, combine them. It's best not to overcode the data because in the end, you will need to reduce the codes to a small number of themes anyways. And ultimately what you're going to do is reduce the list of codes to get perhaps 5 or 7 themes or descriptions of the setting or the participants. Themes, are also known as categories, are similar codes that come together to form a major idea in the data. You can identify the 5 to 7 themes by examining codes that the participants discuss most frequently. The other themes that may arise are ones that the data shows are unique or surprising, are the ones that have the most evidence to support them. The reason for the small number of themes is that it's best to write a qualitative report providing detailed information about a few themes rather than general information about themes. A description is a detailed rendering of the people, the places, the events, in the setting of qualitative research. And you might use codes such as seating arrangements, or teaching approach, or physical layout of the room to describe a classroom where instruction takes place. Okay, I love this visual model of coding, and this is found in your textbook, but it's also in a lot of qualitative textbooks. I remember seeing this visual model back when I was a graduate student, and I think it's a very helpful visual model to help students understand and grasp this concept. So if you look at this and you read from left to right, you initially read through all your data, your observation notes, your field notes, your interview notes, and you have many pages of text. And this is called exploring the data or immersing yourself in the text. The next step is you divide the text into segments of information. So you might highlight sentences or paragraphs that summarize a main point or an issue that you want to code. And then you label these segments of information with codes. So when you're done with one document, you might have, say, 30 to 40 codes that capture the essence of what is in the transcription. And then to make coding, the process of coding and analyzing the data more feasible, you want to collapse, or you want to reduce the redundancy of the code. So you want to, any codes that are similar or that overlap, you collapse them together, and then you ultimately narrow down your codes into approximately 5 to 7 themes. And we'll talk about how you collapse codes into themes in a little bit more detail. But the whole process of qualitative research is to start with many pages of text and to interpret it by segmenting the data into codes and labeling that text that's segmented, putting codes onto that text, and then collapsing the text into themes. So the whole point of qualitative interpretation and analysis is that you want to think about building broad themes that emerge from data. So you need to essentially analyze the data to form answers to your research questions. And this process can involve examining the data in detail to describe what you have learned from your data and the developed themes or a broad category of ideas from the data. So describing and developing themes from the data consists of answering the major research questions and forming an in-depth understanding of the central phenomenon. And this is key, because sometimes when I read student research papers, they don't get to the heart of what the central phenomenon is. They simply just describe. And it's okay to describe, but you need to also get to the heart of themes and describe the process of how you went about to arrive at those themes. So not all qualitative projects include both description and themes. So at the minimum, you have to include the themes, but sometimes qualitative researchers begin with a description to explore the setting and explain what's going on. So a description is a detailed rendering of people, places, events, in a setting in a qualitative research study. And sometimes it's easiest to start the analysis after the initial reading and coding of the data. So in some forms of qualitative research design, such as ethnography or case studies, which we don't have time in this class to learn about, but you would learn about if you took a qualitative research class 2 or an advanced qualitative research class, you would get into the different types of qualitative designs. And in ethnography and in case studies, the researcher provides a considerable description of the setting Describing detail is important, and the researcher analyzes data from all sources, the interviews, the observations, the field notes, to build a portrait or a picture of the individuals or events. So to describe an individual or a participant, the qualitative analyst might ask, what is this person like? Or describe a place, what is this place like? In providing detailed information, description can transport the reader to a research site or help the reader understand and visualize the research site or the participant being interviewed. It does take experience and practice to learn how to describe detail in a setting. And again, as I mentioned earlier, novice researchers tend not to provide as much illustration or as much detail that's needed, but you really want to set the stage and capture the essence of the place or the person in rich, contextualized detail when you're using descriptions in qualitative research. Here's an example of a descriptive passage that was used by a researcher in a qualitative study. And I just want to point out some aspects of this descriptive passage. A descriptive passage always begins with a broad interpretation, or not interpretation, a broad description, and moves to more specific description of the incident. And you want to, when you're writing a descriptive passage, situate the reader in the place of the context as if the reader can see what's going on and feel as if they're there at the scene. You want to provide colorful details that capture the essence of what's happening and allow them to create a sense of being there. You can do this by using action words or vivid modifiers and adjectives. And remember, when you're describing the incident or in the narrative passage, you just want to describe the facts. You don't want to interpret or analyze the facts. You're just giving the reader a strong description of what transpired. And sometimes you can use quotes to emphasize major findings in the incident. As I said in a prior slide, qualitative analysis can include descriptions and themes, but at a minimum, all qualitative research has to include an analysis of thematic development. So because themes are similar codes that are collapsed together to form a major idea from the data, they form a core element in qualitative data analysis. Like codes, themes have labels that typically consist of no more than 2 or 4 words. Through initial data analysis, you as a researcher might find 30 to 50 codes. But as you read through the transcriptions, you need to think about how you can reduce these codes and collapse the code. So any codes that overlap or any codes that are redundant, you're going to collapse those codes. And ultimately, you want to collapse the codes so that you get to about 5 to 7 major themes through this process of eliminating redundancy in the codes. Now, there are several types of themes, and researchers typically identify them as ordinary themes, themes that the researcher might expect to find, or maybe there's unexpected themes that are surprises and that the researcher didn't expect to surface during the study. Or there may be hard to classify themes, themes that contain ideas that do not easily fit into one theme or that overlap with several themes. And then we also have major and minor themes, themes that represent the major ideas and minor secondary ideas in the data. For example, on a study about how students want to quit smoking, a major theme might be attempts to quit smoking, and a minor theme might be a physical reaction, or peer pressure to quit smoking, or starts and stops. It's also helpful to analyze data from multiple perspectives, meaning that you, as a researcher, look at several viewpoints from different individuals and sources of data as evidence for a theme. Multiple perspectives are important when conveying the complexity of a phenomenon in qualitative research. So you might want to observe your participants, interview your participants, and maybe do a document analysis so that you can gain viewpoints from all of these different sources as evidence when you are finalizing your themes in your final research report. In this PowerPoint, we have an example of a thematic passage. And the thematic passage is safety. And we give the title for the theme based on words of the participants. And then we supply evidence for this theme based on the multiple perspectives of participants who are involved in the study. And within these themes, there might be multiple sub-themes or minor themes. And evidence for these themes might be based on short quotes, or we might use the voice of the participant to give voice to the themes. There's a passage in your book on page 249 that goes into more depth explaining how themes can be used for developing narrative passages. One final point I want to make about themes is I get a question from students a lot. How do you know when you've reached your point where you've created all the themes that you possibly can create? And this is called saturation, when themes are fully developed and no new evidence is provided. So saturation is a point where you have identified the major themes and no new information can add to your list of themes or to the detail for existing themes. Now, when you reach saturation is a subjective point, but most qualitative researchers realize when it occurs. It's when they continually read the transcriptions over and over again and no new themes are emerging, no new descriptions are coming forward, and the researchers have drawn on all the information, all the observations, all the field notes, and realized that they've saturated the data. They've found evidence through specific examples and specific quotations that illustrate the theme. And then when they've gone back to review the interview transcripts or observation notes, no new information has surfaced during their rereading of the transcripts. Hence, they can conclude that they have reached saturation on a theme. And a way to double check this is to go back to your participants and ask them if the researcher has adequately captured the themes. And we'll talk about this in a slides that are coming up on that discuss validating the accuracy of findings. But let's also talk about layering and interrelating themes. You will see that many qualitative studies that stop at reporting, description, and themes. However, you can add additional rigor and insight into your study by layering themes or interconnecting them. Layering themes builds on the idea of major and minor themes, but organizes the themes into layers, from basic elementary themes to more sophisticated ones. Layering the analysis is also called first and second order abstractions. And this means representing the data using interconnected levels of themes. You subsume minor themes within the major themes and include major themes within broader themes. The entire analysis becomes more and more complex as the researcher works upward toward more broad and broader levels of abstraction. The number of layers may vary from 2 to 4 or 5, and recognizing these layers will help you understand the use of themes in layered qualitative analysis. Again, you don't have to do a layered analysis, but this just is one more step that you can take to bring sophistication and depth to your analysis. A second thematic analysis is called interrelating themes, and this approach allows you to interconnect the themes. This means that the researcher connects the themes to display a chronology or sequence of events, such as when qualitative researchers generate a theoretical and conceptual model. Okay. And again, you don't have to interrelate the themes. The most important thing I want you to remember from this chapter on how to analyze and interpret qualitative research, which might be your very first exposure to the analysis of qualitative research, is that you want to analyze the data through coding, collapse the codes to create themes that provide rich description and thematic answers to your research questions. All right, let's talk about after you code the data and you've analyzed it for description and themes, how you go about reporting and representing these findings. And this is really important. This in a dissertation becomes your chapter 4, or in a research paper, it becomes your discussion section. And it calls for displaying findings in tables and figures, and also constructing a narrative to explain what you have found in response to each individual research question. Now, qualitative researchers often display their findings visually by using figures or pictures that augment the narrative discussion. And there are different ways to display data. For instance, you can create a comparison table, where you create a visual image of the information in the form of a comparison table or a matrix, which is a table that compares groups on one of the themes from your study. You can also develop a hierarchical tree diagram, and this is a diagram that visually represents themes and their interconnections so that the themes are presented in the order from the broad themes to the narrow themes. You can also present figures, and these are figures with boxes that show the connections among themes, and you'll learn more about this if you take a more advanced qualitative research class, and if you study grounded theory, which is a type of qualitative research. You can also draw a map, which can show the physical layout of a setting. Or you could develop a demographic table where you talk about, or you don't talk about, you write about personal or demographic information of the participants or the sites in the research. Okay, so I just talked about how you represent your findings, and you always have to include the reporting of findings and then the representation of findings, such as the tables or the maps or the diagrams, need to augment the reporting of the findings. So the primary form for representing and reporting findings in qualitative research is always a narrative discussion. And a narrative discussion is basically a written passage in which you, as the author of the study or the researcher, summarizes in detail the findings of the themes from your data analysis. Now, there is no set form of how you have to do this, and it can vary widely from one study to another. However, it is helpful to identify some frequently used forms. And usually, themes are answered. You look in your discussion section, you present the research question, and then you present the themes that have emerged under each research question. But you also want to include dialogue that provides support for the themes. So you want to include the multiple perspective of the themes, or even contradictory evidence. You don't want to have I tell students often, all your findings do not have to be the same. They do not have to be vanilla. If you found chocolate within your vanilla findings, that's great. Tell the reader about the contradictory evidence. If a participant used a metaphor or a specific analogy that you think captures the essence of what they were trying to say, include that in your narrative description. And you can include quotations from the interviews as well. One thing I warn students about is not to overly quote. Sometimes discussion sections are written from novice researchers that are just a string of quotations, and you don't want that. You want the quotation to augment the narrative description. So again, you want to show the themes, but show the contradictions within the themes. Don't feel that all the themes have to be in unison, and use quotations to support the themes, use metaphors, use the voices of the participants, and support each of the themes with detailed descriptions from your findings. Okay, so after you report your findings in qualitative research, you have to present an interpretation of the data. An interpretation in qualitative research means that the researcher steps back and forms some larger meaning about the phenomenon based on the researcher's personal views or comparisons with past literature, or even both. Qualitative research is interpretive research. So as I said earlier, two different researchers who are examining the same transcription might present different interpretations, and that's okay. And you present this interpretation in a section called discussions or conclusions or interpretations or implications. I might have misspoke in a prior slide when I was saying you present the report of the findings under discussions, and that's not true. I want to correct because I misspoke. You have a section that's called findings, where you just list the findings, and then you have a section called discussion, where you explain the findings, what they mean, and how they compare and contrast to prior studies. Okay, so in this section called discussion or interpretations or implications, you want to review all the major themes and the answers to the research questions. You might, as a researcher, bring in your personal reflections about the meaning of the data. For instance, I am a first-generation college student, and I do a lot of research on first-generation college students. So in this section, I always acknowledge my bias, my personal bias, that as a first-generation college student, I bring my own interpretations and subjectivities to my discussions. I also contrast my findings to the literature, what prior researchers have found, and it might be similar, but it might be different, so it's okay to compare and contrast. And I also talk about the limitations of the study and suggestions for future research. Let me talk a little bit about addressing limitations for this study. Similar to quantitative research, the qualitative researcher wants to always suggest possible limitations or weaknesses to their study, and they want to make future recommendations for further research. Now, limitations can be problems that were found in your data collection or unanswered research questions by participants, or better selection of purposeful sampling of individuals for sites for the study. And implications for future research include the use of the findings for practice, or the need for further research by gathering more extensive data and asking additional research questions of the participants. All right, so how do you validate the findings of your qualitative research? This is the last slide in this PowerPoint presentation for Chapter 8. As I've talked about in earlier chapters when I was introducing to you the concept of qualitative research, I wanted to make sure that you were aware that qualitative research sometimes does receive some criticism for being soft in terms of scientific rigor, and that it's biased based on the researcher's interpretation, which is all true, but there are ways that qualitative researchers can make sure that their findings and interpretations are accurate. And validating findings means that the researcher determines the accuracy and the credibility of findings through strategies such as triangulation and member checking. Now, a lot of authors who publish on qualitative research, who are very well known in the field, such as Lincoln and Guba, have addressed this idea. And qualitative researchers do not typically use the word bias. They will say that all research is interpretive and that the researcher should be self-reflective about his and her role or how she or she uses her subjectivities to interpret the findings. I've used the word personal bias in my publication, so it's not that you can't use it, but qualitative researchers look more at the accuracy or the credibility of findings. And these are varied terms that qualitative researchers use to describe the accuracy and credibility, and they're called authenticity and trustworthiness. And these are strategies used to validate qualitative accounts. A popular approach is to rely on something that Lincoln and Guba, who are very well known in the field of qualitative research, came up with an approach to validity. And many authors today cite this source for perspectives on validity. They link validity to quantitative standards. They discuss how trustworthiness in qualitative research projects could be established in 4 ways. Credibility, which is the qualitative counterpart to internal validity. Transferability, which is external validity. From one setting to another can be established by establishing the context of a study and giving detailed descriptions of the procedures. And then there's also dependability, which enables one to repeat a study by using overlapping methods and in-depth methodological descriptions of the procedures. Researchers can address credibility, the qualitative counterpart to bias, by admitting biases and assumptions and acknowledging limitations in the study's methods. But rather than using terms that represent a counterpart to quantitative research validity and reliability, other approaches for qualitative research are unique to qualitative analysis. And I'm going to talk about those 3 right now. There's triangulation. And this is when qualitative inquirers triangulate among different sources of data to enhance the accuracy of a study. So for instance, I did a mixed methods dissertation that had quantitative statistical analysis, but I also had a qualitative section. And in that qualitative section, I used triangulation as a process to corroborate the evidence from different sources. I had document analysis, and interviews and observations. And so between those 3 sources of data, I was able to corroborate whether the descriptions and the themes in the qualitative research supported the same themes. This ensured that the study would be accurate because the information would draw on multiple sources of information and individuals. And it allows the researcher to develop a more accurate and reliable and credible finding. There's also a process called member checking, in which researchers check their findings with participants in the study, determine if their findings are accurate. And member checking is a process which the researcher asks 1 or more participants in the study to check the accuracy of the count. So for instance, after you interview a subject, you might hand them back the transcript and say, does this accurately capture what you were trying to say? Is the description complete and realistic? Are the themes, once you do the analysis and show them the analysis, are they accurate? And does the participant feel comfortable with you including them? And are the interpretations fair and representative? You can also ask somebody outside of your project to conduct a thorough review of the study. And this is done, for instance, in publications when authors go to publish their findings and they have the peer review evaluations of the study. And they ask such questions as, are the findings grounded in the data? Are inferences logical? Are the themes appropriate? Can the inquiry decisions and methodological shifts be justified? And what is the degree of researcher bias? And what strategies are used for increasing credibility?